Hey guys, welcome to the show. Today I have a very special guest, Dr. Joe Rigney, and he has a new book called The Sin of Empathy, Compassion and Its Counterfeits. And this book is amazing. Everyone needs to read it. I mean, I highlighted basically the entire book. It's so good, and I am excited to have Dr. Rigney on the show. We're going to go through the main kind of points in this book, and I think it will be very helpful. And I just highly recommend getting this book. The foreword was written by Rosario Butterfield. So please welcome Dr. Joe Rigney.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So glad to have you on. I love this book, The Sin of Empathy. It's just, yeah, every pastor, every Christian needs to read this. Um, First of all, let's get into, the obvious question. What is empathy? You talk about it. There are three categories of it, but can you briefly describe what you mean by empathy?
Yeah, so this is part of the challenge, isn't it? That these words are a little bit fluid and kind of can mean different things to different people. I've discovered is if you write a book with a title like that, you're always having to explain yourself. Um, Maybe the best way to set it up would be something like this. All of us recognize that virtues can go wrong, like good things can go bad. And so if you take a virtue like courage, which everybody says is a good thing, and you could say it goes wrong in one of two ways. It goes wrong because you don't have enough of it, and that we call that cowardice. Or it could go wrong if you have too much of it, and that would be recklessness. So
Mm-hmm.
that's like, I'm willing to take risks, but they're stupid risks, unwise risks. And what I think people struggle with is that compassion is just like that. It's a virtue. It's a glorious thing. The Bible tells us that we should be kind and compassionate. Christ modeled it for us, but it can go wrong in one of two ways. And everybody recognizes the first way, which is callousness or apathy. I don't care. You're drowning, and I don't care. That we all say that's a vice. That's a problem. Uh, but it can go wrong the other way. You can have too much of it. What would it mean to have too much compassion? Well, it would mean when compassion becomes untethered or unanchored to what is true and what is good, to what is good for someone in the long run, when it becomes all about the immediate feelings and it becomes so powerful and so potent that it sweeps you off your feet, your compassion becomes a liability. It can be very destructive. And
Mm-hmm.
so that's the basic idea, is that at one level, some people might say empathy just means sharing someone's emotions, right? I just share your emotions. You're happy, I'm happy. You're sad, I'm sad. And if that's what they mean, I no debate, no dispute. I'm not attacking that. But if you can't recognize a danger in that, that sometimes your emotions might be bad, they might be wrong, they might be intense, and in sharing them, I might get swept off my feet and end up uh, harming you. I might actually enable you to do great harm to yourself or to others because I'm empathizing with you. That's the sort of thing that I'm concerned about, and that's what I mean by the sin of empathy.
Well, give us just one. We'll get to some more, but give us an example of how it can go wrong. Give us
Yeah.
an
So
example of bad empathy.
yeah. So I think everybody. Let's start with like the nearest example that probably everybody's experienced. Anyone who's ever in, say, their family been put on a guilt trip. So if you have a family member who throws a pity party, maybe you are that family member who throws the pity party, who sulks. In other words, they present to others, look how hard things are for me. I'm suffering. I'm hard, in order to get their way, in order to manipulate or steer a loved one. If you've ever done that or been on the receiving end, that's what, when they give in, that's what I mean. If they give in and they do something that's not right, if they join you in doing something wrong, if they accommodate and enable you to continue in destructive behaviors, that would be a good example of the sin of empathy. Out of compassion for you, I've lost touch with what's good for you.
Okay, and then you say in the book, you say empathy is reactive, sympathy is responsive. Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, so when I use so there I'm using sympathy or compassion in the positive sense, the virtue. And responsive means my head's on screwed on straight. I'm sober minded. I'm thinking, so I feel deeply for you. Like there's a depth of feeling. I'm joining you. I'm suffering with you. But I'm also thinking about what's good for you, and so I can respond to your situation with wisdom and act with wisdom. Whereas to be reactive is simply to be swept off my feet. You feel sad, I feel sad, and whatever you say goes, and I'm just going to follow you. I'm going to basically allow you to steer my emotional vehicle. That's another way to talk about it. My emotions become at the mercy of your emotions, and I basically unhitch from everything else, and your feelings lead the way. And so, in that sense, it's reactive, and it's amazing how quickly this can happen to us. About how emotions are good, but they're powerful, and we have to be mindful of the ways that they can really upend us and take us to some really destructive places.
Yeah, and you use the Great Divorce as an illustration in your book, which is the Great Divorce is by C.S. Lewis. It's an
Mhm.
allegory. It's my favorite C.S. Lewis book.
Yeah,
I actually read it in high school, and I didn't become a Christian until I was 42, but that book kind of haunted me like my whole life because
yeah,
it's so powerful. It's so powerful.
yeah.
But talk about the Great Divorce vis-a-vis this kind of empathy.
Yeah, so empathy is this modern word. It didn't exist until the 20th century. Nobody talked about it. It's a newer term, even though it often is attached to old, realities that are as old as dirt. So in Lewis's day, he talked about it using a language of pity.
Hmm.
And in the story, one of the things that the damned spirits, that the whole setup in the story is that it's a dream of the afterlife in which the narrator witnesses conversations between those who have been damned and those who have been saved. And they knew each other on earth, and now they're having conversations. And in principle, in the story, as the setup goes, the damned could change their minds. They could choose to follow God. They could choose joy. They could choose heaven. But one of the recurring themes is that the damned are always trying to manipulate the solid spirits, these
Hmm.
saints. And one of the ways they do so is by their pity. So one of the characters at the end of the book basically tries to put his wife on a guilt trip by saying, "You don't think about me. I'm going back to the cold and lonely streets. I'm going to be miserable in hell, and you don't care." And she says, "Stop it." And he says, "Oh yeah, you can't handle it. You can't handle the grief, and that you have to turn away from the darkness." And she says, "That's not what I said. Stop it. You're using pity the wrong way around. You're using pity as a kind of emotional blackmail.
Hmm.
You're making yourself miserable, and in your misery trying to, like, pity is meant to be a spur that drives joy to help misery. Like, it's meant, pity, compassion is meant to, we're in a good place, and pity prompts us to go help others who are suffering. That's the way it's supposed to work. You're using it the other way around. You're flopping. You're making yourself miserable in order to awaken my pity so that you can steer me. And that's pity as a tool of emotional blackmail, emotional manipulation. So that's, Lewis depicts it. He doesn't call it empathy because that word didn't exist for him, but he's describing the phenomenon. And my argument has been the modern concept, especially in the last 20 to 30 years, where empathy really becomes this leading virtue, that part of what's going on there is that emotional manipulation, using people's compassion and pity in order to steer them.
Yeah. And then you say in the book, a community in the grip of empathy winds up being characterized by three traits: cowardice, indifference, cruelty. Talk about that for a sec.
Yeah. So cowardice, we end up flattering where we should speak truth. So there's things that we might feel. You can imagine yourself, say, anybody who has extended family maybe has felt this. There's something that needs to be said, but if I say it, they're going to get mad at me. It's going to cause an eruption, and there's tears are going to start to come. It's going to be really emotional. And so it's just better to not say that thing that really does need to be said. So, and we'll justify it, rationalize it in the name of compassion. And that, people might say, well, that's not compassion, that's cowardice. And I'm like, yes, but no one says I'm going to be a coward right now. Instead, what we say is, I'm going to be empathetic right now, and I'll just keep my mouth shut. The indifference and the cruelty are interesting. I think a good, if we move out from the family dynamic to more of the cultural situation, one of the traits when empathy becomes unmoored is it becomes myopic and selective, very selective. So, with debates around abortion, for example, I think are really good illustrations where um, the progressives, those who are pro-abortion, pro-choice, will often put women forward as objects of compassion. Look at these; they're distressed, they're suffering, there's hardships. At the extreme end, here's a someone who was raped and became pregnant, and they awaken compassion in people because of their hardships and the suffering that's been inflicted upon them. And in doing so, we fixate on their suffering and therefore are able to do great evil to their unborn child. Right? The unborn child is then, because of, and we do it in the name of compassion. We wouldn't want to make her life harder, more difficult. And so compassion for her means we are able to be at best indifferent, or worse, cruel. We'll kill the baby out of compassion. It's amazing how much evil can be done in the name of compassion. So those would be some examples. Probably at the far end, like the most the part of the reason I think people um, recognize this dynamic culturally right now and why it's a thing. The trans movement has really leveraged this for a long time successfully, and I think now with some backlash, where in the name of compassion, we're going to castrate children. Right? They're confused. They feel like they're in the wrong body. Their feelings say this. You need to have compassion for them, and compassion means you mutilate their bodies. And so it's amazing how much evil could be done, but compassion is the banner. Compassion is how it's sold. And even or another version of that would be when the doctors would say to a parent whose child is in this confusion, would you rather have a dead son or a live daughter?
Right.
And that's a real attempt to say, it's an appeal to your imagination. Imagine your son dead. Imagine your son dead because you wouldn't affirm their feelings, because you wouldn't join them in their belief that they're a girl. Wouldn't can you live with that? Can your conscience live with that? And so it's a manipulation of their parental compassion to get them to stop resisting the ideology that's being inflicted upon their child.
Yeah, it's interesting because you mentioned the trans movement, and we kind of like at this point in culture, we sort of bypass the gay movement because it's
Yeah.
kind of like passe.
Yeah.
But the reason it's passe is because they were so successful at convincing. And even I talked about this on my show before. After the Ball, that book. I don't
Yeah.
know if you've read After the Ball,
Oh
but
yeah.
those two guys, Madsen and Kirk, they said, there's a section in that book where they say, we need to become victims and really have the hetero world or heterosexuals see us as victims.
Right.
And so that technique worked.
Yes.
Or that gambit worked. So it's just interesting that like we talk, it's kind of like that's ancient history now,
Yeah.
but it's still,
But it's not.
but it's not. Yeah.
And I actually think that's one of the places where the trans stuff has gone so far that it's created this backlash, but it really does need to go. You have to root it out all the way down, because otherwise you end up in situations where if you present as a victim, then everybody orients to you. You set the agenda. Like that's like part of the move is in a society that's in a highly empathetic society, a society that has become unmoored in its foundations and is running on feelings. The greatest victim wins. So, and this is, I think, one of the ways that you can kind of how did what we now call wokeness, how did that hijack churches and society? Well, that's how is it real? The rules became victimhood confers invulnerability, and so the greatest victim wins. And so what happened? Well, you had the victimhood Olympics, and everybody
Right.
just competed, and you just piled up oppressions and piled up victimhood, because whoever was the greatest victim set the agenda for everybody. The rest of society will reorganize around you and your feelings, and that's been the story over the last 20 plus years, longer maybe, of why are we doing these insane things? Like that's what hijacked it. Is our compassion become untethered from what was true and good?
Yes, I was actually going to quote that from your book, but you just did. So, but it's interesting because also side B Christians, as they're
Yes.
called, the Revoice group, they'll say things like "I'm a sexual minority,"
Right.
and they'll use all this kind of terminology around victimhood, and so that's just another thing that's crept into the church as well, besides all the wokeness. But you mentioned in the book, you mentioned these three kind of stages in our history in terms of Christianity. there's the positive world, which is pre 1994, the neutral world, which is 1994. Well, in the positive world, society at large retains a mostly positive view of Christianity. And then the neutral world is 1994 to 2014. Society takes a neutral stance towards Christianity. And then negative world is 2014 to the present, where society has come to have a negative view of Christianity. And you say that in the book, it was in the neutral world that empathy began to weaken the church's foundation. Talk about that.
Yeah, so that's Aaron Wren's three worlds framework that I'm drawing on there. So he's the one who came up with that, and what I'm connecting the dots is there's some we see the fruit of it in what we now call negative world, in which Christian moral norms, if in the earlier stages, in the first stage they were respected, Christian moral norms was the baseline of society. In neutral world, they might be an oddity, but you're allowed at a seat at the pluralistic table. In negative world, Christian, say, sexual ethics isn't just mistaken, but evil, right? To hold to one man, one woman marriage is to be a bigot and to be an evil person. And so it's like, so we see the fruit of that, man, this hostility and this outright rejection, not just of Christ as the savior of the world, but the whole moral framework that undergirds Christianity. How did that happen? Well, it was weakened in neutral world as Christians wanted a seat at that pluralistic table, and the price of entry was to be the right kind of Christian. Well, how do you define, and the right kind of Christian in this context meant the left kind of Christian, meaning a progressive Christian, a Christian with a little progressive on their shoulder, actually, who is evaluating whether or not you're being kind enough, loving enough, compassionate enough, empathetic enough, which meant that basically the left became the arbiter of whether you were being Christian enough. And you see attempts at this now. I think it was a few weeks ago, I think it was Sunny Hostin on The View. There was a clip that kind of circulated where she was rebuking Christians who had voted for Trump and who were supporting his immigration policies and things like that. And she was saying, you don't care about my lived experience, and you don't care about the LGBTQ, and you don't care about immigrants, and you don't care about, you're being callous, heartless, and ungodly. And it's like, at this point, there's a lot of Christians who have, I think, wised up to the play that's been run on them. And so they respond the way that J.D. Vance did, which is, I don't really care, Margaret. Like that's like, there's now we have a backbone. But if you'd have done that, say 5 years ago, that would have had a lot of purchase among Christians. We don't want you to think that we're callous. We don't want you to think that we're heartless. And so it became a big steering wheel on the back of Christians, and progressives were able to leverage it in order to mute the church's witness on certain issues and co-opt the church for other agendas. So you have to care about these issues in order to be faithfully Christian.
And this is a fascinating part of your book. You talk about, what is the progressive gaze? Gaze, not Gays. What is the progressive gaze?
Well, I just like to say that there is a little bit of a happy pun that happens right there. So the progressive gaze, you don't want to live under the progressive gaze or the progressive gaze, either one. The idea there, this is actually a concept I borrowed. I learned it during the kind of height of the woke moment when critical theory and intersectionality were all the rage. It's a concept that Toni Morrison, the Black novelist,
I read Beloved, and it was terrible. Yeah. Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, but she has this. She put forward this idea that like Black authors basically have an imaginary white guy on their shoulder, critically evaluating everything they do, and they feel like they have to justify themselves to that little white guy on the shoulder. That they're writing under the white gaze, and I thought that was actually a really useful psychological concept to think about. That there's this imaginary, idealized audience that before whom I live and move and have my being, that I am operating before them, and they're kind of deciding whether or not I'm living rightly, I'm up to snuff, whether I'm doing things sufficiently, or at the very least, they're the one that I'm trying to explain myself to. I need to make things comprehensible to them. And I thought that was a fruitful psychological concept, and just said, I think evangelicals in particular have come to live under the progressive gaze, meaning it's progressive sensitivities that we have to be aware of. It's progressive hostilities that we have to share, progressive enemies that we must oppose, progressive interest groups that we must appease. And so there's a little progressive, every pastor in America for a while had a little progressive on his shoulder, evaluating whether his sermon was sufficiently sensitive to racial minorities, sexual minorities, women. You pick the group that progressives put forward. You
And
had to
and they
have
posted black squares on their Instagram.
exactly,
I
and that
noticed.
and so the idea there was is I'm signaling my virtue under the progressive gaze. I'm showing that, hey, I'm a good person.
Right.
I don't think that I'm not like those Christians. And I think that's another element that came into play here is it wasn't just empathy. That's a big part of the story. But the other piece of it was this kind of desire for respectability or credibility. I'm the good kind of Christian, not that bad kind of Christian. I'm not those culture warriors. I'm not like Jerry Falwell. I'm not like those moral majority folks from of old. I'm different than them. I'm winsome. I want to,
Right.
and it was this cultural posture that differentiated from other Christians in order to appease progressive audiences. And that just kind of like spread through evangelicalism in particular. And
Yeah.
again, progressive billionaires discovered a really potent steering wheel to keep the church on the sideline or to co-opt it altogether.
Yeah, and it also spread into evangelical seminaries where there were all sorts of groups on campus suddenly who were all victim groups, and they needed special coddling and attention and special safe spaces.
Right.
Anytime I see the word spaces, I immediately just shut down. I can't
Yes.
hear the word space. But we don't need spaces.
Yes.
We just need to be
Just
human beings.
yes. Just man up a little bit. Like
Man up. That's what I mean. Yeah. And you mentioned that terms like you talk about terms like abuse
Mhm.
and trauma being enlarged
Yeah.
because of this. Talk about that.
Yeah. So one of the things that happened is a term like abuse, which at one time had a pretty defined sense, like it meant sexual violence, physical violence. That's what the word abuse meant. Um, but because it was such a potent term, language inflation kicked in and it began to apply to all sorts of other things that a previous generation would not have regarded as abuse at all. Rightly, they would have said, "No, that's just disagreement. That's not abuse. You just disagree. That's just correction. You guys are that's normal human conflict. That's not abuse." But because no one wanted to be thought of as an abuser or an abuse enabler, and instead it was believe all women, it
Mhm.
was, no questions asked, nothing like that. You've got to just accept it, validate it, affirm it, and go along with whatever then follows, whatever prescriptions are offered to your church or your denomination or your community in order to right these wrongs. You've just got to keep your mouth shut. And the real tragedy of this, I think people hear me talk sin of empathy and think I must be a real heartless person. But the reality is that I care about actual victims.
Right.
And so in this, the language inflation meant that people who have really had horrific things happen to them get lost in the shuffle. They get used as pawns in a game of power, where we're going to use their suffering in order to steer denominations because we want to seize power. We want the denomination, and I know that in certain cases, the people doing that, these advocates who kind of weaponized these concepts, started off with the best of intentions. They cared about hurting people, or maybe they themselves had awful things happen to them, and now they want to prevent it for others. But because their compassion and their pursuit of justice became untethered from actual biblical justice, it just led to just all kinds of destruction and introduced these really gnarly dynamics into churches where you couldn't actually even have a rational conversation. You couldn't ask questions of, well, is that statistic right? Because to even say, well, that statistic seems kind of high. I don't think that statistic is actually true. Do you not care about women? Do you not care about abuse? Why can't you just listen? And it was those sort of like that's an appeal to emotion. It squashes any logical discussion, rational discussion, biblical discussion under a wave of emotion and counts on other soft-hearted people to get you back into line. The nice guys, the respectables are going to come along and say, hey, we need to listen, right? We need to be humble. But here it's not humility before God. It's humility before activists, humility before agitators, humility before
Mhm.
victims. That's where the humility comes, and it inverts the standard. And it's because I actually care about real suffering people that I don't want this inflation of language that allows for this manipulation.
And you mentioned another common tactic involved in reducing biblical truths to platitudes, and then using those platitudes to overcome resistance to particular progressive political or cultural priorities. And then you use the example of, quote, love your neighbor, therefore get vaccinated. The world is watching. The world is watching, therefore we must address this alleged abuse crisis in our denomination.
Yeah.
Or those are some of the ideas, but yeah,
Yeah.
that's another kind of tactic.
Yeah. Right. So basically, I think a lot of times there was underlying um, emotional manipulation that was masked by biblical platitudes. So love your neighbor, get the vax was basically a way of saying if you think that COVID is not as serious as the state says it is, and if you therefore think it's not worth the risk to do this experimental vaccine, like if you make that calculation for yourself and your family, well, that means that you're a heartless, cruel, evil person. And you don't want to be a heartless, evil, cruel person, don't you? Don't you? Jesus said to love your neighbor. And so the appeal is you want to be a compassionate person. You want to love your neighbor. That's what Jesus says. But then there's this big leap to this particular risky action that's demanded. And you're not allowed to ask questions. You're not allowed to say time out. You're not allowed to say not right now. Let's wait and see. All of that is out the door. It's short circuited because love for neighbor, compassion for neighbor. Do you really want to kill grandma? Right. Those were the tools of manipulation that preyed upon the sin of empathy. Right. That's how those things work. And the world is watching was a similar one. And the world there was always presumed to be elite, coastal, secular, and progressive. Nobody, no, when any Christian over the last 20 years said the world is watching, I guarantee you none of them meant the coal miner in the red hat who hadn't been to church since he was 8. He's watching. So you should, support social policies that will appeal to him. Nobody ever thought that. Well, why doesn't he count? Should we care about his, which interest groups do we appeal to? Who are we trying to be winsome toward? All of those questions were bypassed, and it was the progressive definitions that reigned.
Yeah, and you say that in your book, you say the progressive gaze is poses the greatest threat to Christian faithfulness.
Yeah. Yeah, so the idea there is that in principle, the idea of the gaze at one level is just people pleasing. Like if you're looking for where do you get that from the Bible? It's like, well, Paul says you can either please man or you can please Christ. You can serve man or you can serve Christ. Those are the two options. You can't do both. You can't serve two masters, Jesus says. And so in principle, any human being, any human community you could live under that gaze. So there could be a right-wing gaze. There could be living under the male gaze or whatever. You could find all other things. In principle, those are on the table. But in the West, in America, in the 21st century, whose gaze dominates? Which viewpoint is the dominant viewpoint in? And you just pick your institutions: education, business, technology, government, right? All the major political parties, all the major corporations, the social media things, with the exception maybe of X. Like all of these different institutions are reinforcing a common way of viewing the world, and that elevates certain identity groups above others as worthy objects of compassion. And so because of that, even though I can imagine communities where people would be steered by trying to be too right wing, right? Like I can imagine that pressure would come. It can't have the same cultural potency because currently the left holds most of the power. And you say, well, what about Trump? Trump's just got elected, right? And how's that working out, right? He did all these executive orders, and now they're all tied up in court, and the bureaucracy is hitting back, and judicial tyranny is making a comeback, and so you have all of these things that are stymieing him, and it's like because the operating system for society is that progressive ideology that then wields Christian compassion and respectability for its own purposes.
Yes. And you have a chapter in your book called Feminism, Queen of the Woke. So talk about, feminism. I've done so many episodes on feminism and how absolutely destructive it is to society, civilization, how it's destroyed the family, how it's destroyed marriages, just everything. And all the fallout from that: homelessness, drug addiction, mental illness, and so on. But so talk about how feminine, what has feminism's impact been on the church?
Yeah. So, you mentioned before there was trans, the gays used this to manipulate. Well, there was the feminist movement did a similar thing first. And
Yes.
they weren't the first in history. Like all people have been throwing pity parties and doing the sulks for as long as they've been
Mhm.
alive. I'm almost positive that in the garden or right after the garden, Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel tried to steer each other by their emotions. Okay. So this is an old phenomenon.
Yeah.
And, but one of the things that we have to recognize is that men and women are different, and women in particular are the more empathetic or compassionate sex
Mhm.
by God's design. And I make a real clear point in this. This is actually a really great design feature that God
Yes.
has built into women. It's why they're so effective at nurturing, caring, hospitality. They're first responders when people are suffering. They're able to intuit somehow this magic sense of like why their baby is crying who can't even talk, right? They're highly attuned to emotions in general, right? Now, everybody exceptions, outliers, whatever. But in general, everybody recognizes women are the more empathetic sex. Well, what that means is that's a really great blessing in its place when it comes to nurture and care and being the glue that holds communities together. What a great blessing. But things that are a blessing in one place become destructive when they're taken out of that place and asked to do something they're not designed for. So when it comes to guardianship, when it comes to
Mhm.
drawing clear lines, when it comes to setting a perimeter, when it comes to defining the doctrine and worship of the church or having a border as a nation, that same compassion actually becomes a liability. And this is why we can see, say, over the last 70 years, every denomination that became feminist, that said women can be pastors or priests or whatever, every denomination that made that decision within 20 years or less sanctioned sodomy, adopted gay marriage, went full on, abandoned every semblance of biblical morality when it came to sexual ethics. Why did they do that? And the answer is because what we talked about earlier. If a victim class comes to a female pastor and says, "We're victims and your doctrines hurt our feelings," right? You say no, and that really bothers us. Then the feminine impulse is to say, well, we don't want that. Let's remove that boundary, remove that standard, remove that law, and instead accommodate and appease it. And so this is what has happened to all of the mainline denominations in the United States is they adopted feminism and then immediately went off the rails in terms of their not just their moral doctrine, but the doctrine of hell, all of the hard doctrines, all of the hard truths, penal substitutionary atonement, all of those are going to get left behind because people's feelings will be hurt because women aren't designed for that guardianship role. Men are. Now, so that's the basic kind of argument. Now, the additional one that I want to make is that good men, particularly good men, who have been taught their whole lives you don't hit girls, and want to be sensitive and kind and caring for women, as the Bible tells them to. Right, husbands, live with your wife in an understanding way. That would be a good kind of empathy, I suppose. Right. What do things look like from her perspective? Take that into account. Good men then find it really difficult to deal with female distress, female agitation, and therefore it activates their own agitation, which then gets covered over by their empathy, right? So their empathy, they start to share that agitation and they want to do anything they can to make it go away. And so this is why churches that are trying to appease or accommodate sensitive women or agitated women eventually go woke or go liberal as well. Like even the men go along with it because it's hard to resist that kind of emotional agitation. So that's what I mean. Feminism feeds that by preaching the lie of interchangeability, that men and women are just, they're both interchangeable. There's no
Mhm.
distinctions, no different gifts, callings, roles,
Design.
design, all of those things that doesn't exist. We're just interchangeable, and therefore, when that lie takes root, it enables this kind of hijacking.
And you say in the book, but nowhere is this pathological feminine empathy more evident than in the various controversies surrounding transgenderism.
Yeah. So this is a great argument that Louise Perry, who's I don't believe she's a Christian at all, but she writes a lot on kind of women's issues, and she just notes that when the trans movement presents themselves as victims, women become mothers. And so they orient to victims the way mothers orient to a child who has just scraped their knee, and therefore they're not going to insist that like Bruno, okay, we'll call Bruno a woman now because we don't want to hurt Bruno's feelings because Bruno's oppressed and Bruno's a victim. Um, and so that's why you have this really strange phenomenon where feminists, self-proclaimed feminists, are enabling kind of the dismantling of womanhood, right?
Hmm.
Justice Jackson, Jackson, um,
Yes.
yes, she couldn't answer the question. She couldn't
What is
answer
a
the question.
woman?
What is a woman? She couldn't answer the question. Why? Because to answer it accurately would hurt people's feelings, and there would be agitators and advocates who would be after her for saying that a woman is the sex that can bear children. If she defined woman in terms of childbearing or in terms of uh, chromosomes or whatever, she would be pilloried, um, because they don't want to be seen as uncompassionate or uncaring. And there's a kind of, it's the mama bear phenomenon, but for childless women. They don't have children to nurture, but that maternal nature that God gave them is still there and looking for an outlet. And so it fixates then on the most deranged um, victims that they can find, and therefore accommodates, appeases, and demands that all of society reorient around these so-called victims. And this is why even when feminists like the feminists like a J.K. Rowling type feminist resist that, they actually don't have the philosophical roots to be able to do it, because they sowed the seeds and they just don't like the fruit, right? They're
Right.
like, they undermine the
I
differences between
exactly.
men and women, and now they're saying too far. So I thought this, for example, a good example is Nancy Mace, the congresswoman from South Carolina, who has, over the last few months kind of led the charge against transgenderism in Congress. There's
Yes.
a man, demented man, who thinks he's a woman, who's a congressman from Delaware. And what bathroom is he supposed to use? Well, Nancy Mace is the one who says he has to use the men's bathroom, not ours. But Nancy Mace was the first graduate of the Citadel, first female graduate of the Citadel. And
Right.
so she invaded male spaces, right? Traditionally male spaces, the military. She invaded those spaces in order to break the glass ceiling under the ideology of feminism, but then didn't like the results. All of a sudden, then men try to invade the female spaces, and no, now we have spaces. Now we have spaces that you can't come. Well, what about the other? And so you can't. And then, of course, she's the one who's going to say trans is bad, but I'm in favor of gay marriage. I'm in favor of gay marriage. I'm a feminist, and it's like, you want to be a little bit pregnant. Like, your problem is you want to be a little bit pregnant and stay there, but that's not how pregnancy works. If you sow those seeds, right, eventually you get that fruit. You have to go back much deeper and recover a vision of human beings that really honors both the dignity and the worth and the differences between men and women.
Yeah, it's interesting. First of all, I just want to say, be careful what you wish for. But I
Right.
also, it's interesting to me. Dave Rubin, he is a gay man. He calls himself a gay man. He's married to another man. They have surrogate babies, and he's always going on and on about the trans stuff.
Right.
But he doesn't even. It's he has this like blind spot
Right.
that his situation is what led to that. It's
Right.
like, so he doesn't even see that he himself is part of the problem of that.
Correct. And so, yeah, there's this idea. I saw a clip of the president the other day on the trans stuff where he was basically saying, no matter how much makeup you put on or surgeries you have, you're not a woman. No matter how much you do it, you're not a woman. And there's a similar way, and like the anus isn't a sex organ, right? It's,
Mhm.
it's the same kind of confusion. And conservatives really have to, Christians especially have to really get this, because um, we can't you can't get upset that the Supreme Court justice doesn't know what a woman is if you don't know what marriage is, and if you don't know what sex is, and if you don't know what men are for and women are for, and how it all works. Like, if you can't answer those questions clearly, then all you've done is shown the left how to do it, how to evade reality. But there is this real big blind spot um, among ostensible conservatives on certain issues, when they fail to recognize that by pretending that men can marry each other, they've already given away the game on the sexuality issue by pretending that men and women are interchangeable. You can't treat men and women as interchangeable and then get mad when people believe you.
Right. And I like how you talk about in the book, you talk about this slippery slope that we've kind of discussed briefly, but you talk about these I think it's 4 stops. So
Yeah.
the first stop is I'm not that kind of complementarian. We'll talk about you just talk about the
Yeah.
four stops and what
Yeah.
it's led to.
Yeah, so complementarian is this. If you don't know what that word means, it's the notion. It's one way to talk about the biblical teaching that men and women are equal in dignity, but have different roles in church, in the family, in society. They're made for different things. They're both human. They're both valuable to God. They both have dignity, but it's different.
Mhm.
Uh, and so that's been the teaching of the Bible forever. And in the 1980s, that term was used to describe it as a kind of reaction to feminism.
Right.
But what these 4 stops are basically certain conservatives start to blush at this point, and at first they'll say, "I'm not that kind of complementarian," meaning someone who's like a little more patriarchal or something like that. Like there's a differentiation from the wrong kind, and then they eventually move to stop 2, which says, "Well, I'm neither a complementarian nor an egalitarian. I'm neither. I'm this third way thing."
And
And
by the
then
way, just what is an egalitarian? Just for
egalitarian would be usually that's used to describe a Christian who believes that, say, that men aren't the head of their homes. It could be men or women, or you don't need a head, and would believe that women can be pastors,
right.
ministers. So that's egalitarians. And so this group will say, I'm neither one. I'm neither this nor that. I'm a third way. And then finally they admit, no, I'm actually just an egalitarian. I do believe women can be pastors. And then the very next step is going to be sodomy's okay.
Yeah.
That's
Yes.
the
You
next
say
step.
and stop 4. Sodomy is cool.
Yeah, right. Which is what you have in all of these progressive denominations that have abandoned all semblance of biblical roots, and therefore they're flying the rainbow flag. They're doing baptisms with glitter. There's all kinds of folly that's being done. It's like, how did they get there? And it's like it started back with the rejection of God's design for men and women. That's at the root, which is ultimately a rejection of the Creator. He made you this way, and this is good for you. Like manhood is a glorious thing. Womanhood is a glorious thing. Male female marriage is a beautiful. Like it's people are made this way, right? Like women are the sort of people that people come out of, right? Like this is an amazing thing, and we treat it like it's a problem to be solved. Like that's the kind of like deep rooted thing it's in the modern American mindset is so deeply rooted that it inevitably, if you reject God's design, eventually you end up in all kinds of folly.
Um, yes, and when I was rejecting God's design until I was saved 15 years ago, I was pro abortion. I was a feminist. I was everything. I was just a commie pinko lefty kind of
Yeah.
guy, living in LA, going to Ariana Huffington's house for cocktail parties.
Right.
And it's interesting when I got saved, that all went away. I
Yeah.
became the exact antithesis of all of that. So it's just
So
interesting.
you sense like there is a kind of like package deal to those things.
It is, yeah, because when I got literally, it was the day I got saved. I understood number one, the fall, which and I obviously believed it was true. And once I understood the fall, I was no longer a Rousseauian.
Right. Yeah.
I was no longer like Ariana Huffington, who thought, the world could be a utopia somehow if
Yeah.
we just had the right politics and policies in place. And then the second aspect was I understood the Imago Dei. So I immediately became pro-life the
Right.
day I got saved. And that changed everything.
Yeah.
Um, and then, so yeah, it was a package deal for me.
Yeah. Yeah.
And there's one other, hold on one sec. Got to find it now. You talk about being sober-minded and compassionate.
Yeah.
And you say insisting on tethering our pity means that we must labor to be both sober-minded and compassionate in order that in that order. In other words, sober-mindedness is a prerequisite for faithful compassion.
Right.
What does that mean?
Yeah. So sober-mindedness is my way of one of the ways to speak about the opposite of this untethered empathy is to say, don't get drunk on other people's passions. Okay,
Yeah.
so sober-mindedness, right? Typically, we think of that in terms of alcohol or drugs, but you could get drunk on more than alcohol. You can get drunk on people's feelings, your feeling. You can get, we talk this way. We can be blinded by anger. We could be overwhelmed by grief. We could be paralyzed by fear. Like that language implies like there's a deep impairment because my passions are raging. Well, empathy basically tries to hook you up to other people's passions, and they can have the same effect of you get wobbly, you get drunk on other people's passions. So sober-mindedness says, I'm not going to get drunk on other people's passions. I'm going to govern my passions. I'm going to submit myself to God. He rules me, and I rule my passions. When you do that, that doesn't mean now you're a heartless automaton. What it means is your compassion can actually be channeled in fruitful and helpful and good ways. You can actually think, what would be good for this person? You can afford to be compassionate because you have some roots. When you don't have roots, the analogy I use most often to illustrate some of the empathy stuff is if someone's drowning, callousness wants to stand on the side. Apathy sits on the sidelines and doesn't care. Untethered empathy jumps in and drowns with them. But true compassion, the kind that Jesus modeled for us and commends to us, says, I'm going to grab onto a branch, or I'm going to tie a rope to a branch, and then I'm going to tie it to my waist, and then I'm going to jump in and I'm going to grab them. But now I've got something to pull us both out.
Yeah.
There's an anchor. And that sober-mindedness is that anchor. It says, I'm keeping one foot on the shore. I'm going to pursue their ultimate good, not simply cater to their immediate feelings. That's what I mean. You can afford to be compassionate. So I'm not arguing for heartlessness or
Hmm.
apathy. I'm saying in order to be actually helpful and compassionate, you have to have a certain kind of anchoring outside of people's feelings.
Yes, and I was just I just thought of this, that when we were talking about this earlier, uh, that when we're talking about the feminist movement and the feminism and how it affects this whole thing, is I have found over the years that when a child comes out as gay or trans, it's usually the mother who ends up caving to it.
Right.
And I've had many friends who have had very solid Christian parents, and but when they come out as gay, it's usually the mother that becomes gay affirming, and the father
First.
doesn't.
Yeah. Or she comes first, and then
Right.
this is where female
Yes, her
agitation
distress. He can't handle the distress
can't
of her,
handle it.
so
And so,
he's like, okay, I'm on board.
yeah, that's exactly right. And you can see that that's a deep corruption of what God designed to be a design feature, right? So a mother sees her child in distress and wants to relieve it, wants to do anything to make it better, right? She wants to kiss the boo boo. She wants like that mother's um, comfort in that way. And so if the child says, "This is who I am," mom wants to accept, right? She's wired
Yes.
to do this, which is why like there needs to be some boundaries. She needs to have both a husband, and then she needs to have a wider community that's going to say no, right? There needs to be like, this is one of the blessings of a Christian society, quite frankly,
Yeah.
is that these sorts of things run up against all sorts of barriers in law, but it's not even barriers in law that's the main thing. It's the culture and the custom of the people to say, no, we are the sort of people who do what God says. And that sort of then restrains all manner of evil, not just when it comes to our sexual ethics, but all sorts of stuff that we take for granted, having lived in a society that at one time was substantively Christian, that had deep Christian roots, and is trying to somehow hold itself together as it's abandoned those roots.
Yes, amen to that. Okay, so let's leave it there. Guys, the book is The Sin of Empathy, Compassion and Its Counterfeits by Joe Rigney. Uh, thank you for coming on the show. Where can people find this, and where can people find you?
Yeah, so you can find me on X, Joe_Rigney. If you're looking for the book, the best way, get it from the publisher, right? Amazon wants its cut, but do they really need any more? So
No.
sinofempathy.com, you can get it direct from the publisher, along with its prequel. I don't know how you want to think about it, but it's called Leadership and Emotional Sabotage, that goes much deeper in what sober-mindedness means, essentially. Like, so Sin of Empathy is more of a diagnostic of where we are and what the problems are. That book is more, where do we go from here? How do you become a sober-minded leader who can have compassion but be anchored? So those would be two great places to go follow up.
Okay, we'll put those links down below. But
Great.
thank you, Dr. Joe Rigney, for coming on the show. I appreciate it.
I appreciate it too.